Hello, and whether you're watching live or recording, welcome to today's webinar, the Homeowners Guide to Going Solar, Part 2, Understanding Incentives and Solar Financing Options. My name is Chantal Stevens with Solar Washington, and this is a short 30-minute presentation followed by a few additional minutes to answer any questions you may have if we have the time. In that spirit, I will make my introductory remarks very short, since most of today's viewers also saw the part one presentation. If you haven't, please watch the recording on the webinar page. So at Solar Washington, we work through education and community involvement to promote the sustainable development and equitable use of solar energy and its contribution to the economic, environmental, and social fabric of Washington. Our work, though independent, is only possible because of the support of our sponsors and members, and we are grateful for that support. We would like to invite you to get involved and support our vision of 100% clean energy Washington. You can do that by joining as a member or sponsor, donating to our work, and attend the 2024 Solar Summit, October 4 in Seattle. This is the second webinar in a series of 5 webinars where we'll take you on a journey from wondering whether solar is right for you to thinking about what other improvements could be done once solar is installed. Next, we'll talk about where the rubber hits the road again, getting and reviewing solar quotes. We are still incredibly lucky that one of our board members is someone with remarkable knowledge of solar from her experience with many facets of the clean energy realm, working with an installer, then for different departments of Washington State, and now serving as a Solar Washington member while working in government affairs for a public utility district. She also runs a consulting company that helps people and organizations navigate solar. So, Deborah.
One moment for logistics. All right, here we are. Hello, everyone. So as Chantal shared, today we are talking about part 2 of our Homeowners Guide to Going Solar series, Understanding Incentives and Solar Financing Options. Today we're going to go over a really brief recap of part 1 to just kind of give you a reminder of what we talked about. You can also watch that recording on our website at any time. And then we're going to talk about what solar incentives are available in Washington State and how the various solar financing options typically work. And then we'll give some next steps and a preview of what part 3 of our series looks like, getting and reviewing your solar quote. So before we dive into it, I just want to do a quick fact check on some of the solar ads that I think a lot of us probably are getting on social media, Google, YouTube, things like that. And those are ads that are advertising things like free solar or getting paid to go solar or just no cost solar. And really what those ads are typically advertising is a solar contract and agreement where the goal is the energy savings from the solar and the incentives from the solar are larger than your monthly cost to have the solar installed. So the idea is basically the solar pays for itself. Really what that means is in some ways they're almost selling loans more than they're actually selling the solar installation. So if you see an ad that says free solar or no cost solar, chances are really that's what the advertisement is about, is that financing mechanism trying to balance out with the savings from the solar. And then there's also some liberties sometimes taken with the use of things like get paid or payments in ads. And really what that's talking about is the incentive programs available. Now, in Washington State, there really aren't any, here is a check, you are getting paid a financial amount that you can then do whatever you want with after going solar. most of the incentives are waivers or credits that can't actually be cashed out in a way that we might assume a payment could be. So just want to clear those things up to kind of give some context and then dive into what these incentives and financing options actually look like. So a quick recap of part one. We talked about the various components of a solar installation, the types of installations, roof materials and considerations for installing on those roofs. And then we looked at how energy production is calculated and what impacts that, including location, the direction the solar panels face, and how much shade might be impacting the solar. And then we also shared how to calculate potential system sizes, costs, and energy savings just based on information you can look up yourself online. And then as a reminder, if it turns out that solar really doesn't work for you on your home, there are community solar programs and green power programs available as alternative ways to support or benefit solar without actually installing it on your home. And then we also briefly touched on the fact that in Washington state, homeowners associations can't make rules prohibiting solar installations. So the federal tax credit is one of the biggest solar incentives available nationwide, and we in Washington state qualify for it. It is a 30% tax credit on the cost of the installation and the components and the labor. So it's percentage based, which means the more you pay for solar, the more of a incentive payment, sorry, I used the word payment, the more of an incentive you get from the federal government. The thing is this is a credit against your tax liability. So if you don't owe taxes, if you're low income or retired or anything that would change that tax liability for you, you might not qualify for the full amount because it has to be credited against your existing tax liability. Now you can take multiple years to claim that 30% federal tax credit. So, a little bit year one, a little bit year two, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not a check that the government sends you and the way that some companies will advertise. The other thing is there are rules with the tax credit, like you must live in the house that you're installing the solar on. There are some rules around things like rental properties or vacation homes, but for the residential side of the tax credit, there are rules, whereas there might be an option under the business tax credit if you have an LLC or commercial property or anything like that. So it just depends on your situation, but for homes, you pretty much have to live there. And then again, this isn't refundable. The federal government is not just going to send you a check for 30% of the installation cost. It gets credited against your tax liability. And then some common things that there are questions about and or aren't necessarily made clear at the time of installing solar, and that is that roofing does not count. So if you have to get your roof replaced as part of installing solar, or if a solar company tells you, yeah, if you install a new roof at the same time that you do solar, you can get the federal tax credit on both. That is not true. So Chantal's going to put two links in the chat. One's to the IRS webpage and the other is to the Department of Energy webpage. And they both say fairly clearly, roofing does not count. The other thing that doesn't count is loan interest and fees. So if you have a loan for your solar or you were charged a loan fee of some kind, you can't claim those against the federal tax credit. The other one that can be kind of interesting is second-hand solar panels don't qualify. It's only the original installation, it's only the original purchase of the solar panels that qualify, which can be limiting. However, if you're someone who already might not be eligible for the tax credit, one of the things you could do is look into secondhand solar panels as a way to save a little bit of money. It might not end up being a dollar for dollar compared with the federal tax credit, but if you're not going to get the tax credit anyway, it is an option. So there are some things that are eligible costs that aren't specifically solar related. One of those things is the electrical panel. If you have to have an electrical panel upgrade in order to be able to install solar, then that typically can be claimed as part of the solar installation. That can include things like there isn't enough space in your electrical panel. That can include things like you just have an out-of-date panel that can't hold the load or pass inspection or anything like that. So that is an option, but also You could get a quote from an electrician versus solar installer and find out the electrician's less expensive. Typically, what I've found is a reputable solar installer. It's less expensive for them to do the panel change out because it is part of a larger project. Some of the less reputable solar companies charge a pretty significant premium for an electric panel change out, so just something to be aware of. You cannot include the cost of a new roof, like we talked about. If you need a new roof, you need to do that separately. A minor repair, that is allowed, is what I've been told, is if you've got like a loose shingle that you're going to need to reshingle that little stretch in order to safely put the solar panel anchor in that spot, that can be allowed, but an entire roof does not qualify. The exception being if it is a solar shingle roof, but those aren't typical yet, so we won't get into the details. And then again, loan terms, fees, interest, those don't qualify either. So you can't take the total financed end of loan life amount and apply that to your tax credit. So the federal tax credit, one of the sales tactics you hear a lot is that programs are ending, hurry, time's limited. So the 30% federal tax credit is actually stair-stepping down. So you can claim up to 30% through 2032. If it's installed through 2032, excuse me, because you can take a few extra years to claim it. In 2023, that goes down to 26%, and in 2034, it goes down to 22%. So if you're in a situation where you think your tax liability might be higher in a few years, or financially it might not be the right time for you to go solar, you do still have time. And then we're going to do a quick recap from part one. So in part one, we shared this document, spreadsheet, walkthrough of how to calculate the potential solar system size you would need to fully power your home in terms of credits and energy production. And then we turn that into how much would a system like this cost? So in this example, let's say you're in a home that uses 10,000 kilowatt hours a year of electricity. You're in an area where you could expect to produce 1,200 kilowatt hours a year per kilowatt of solar installed. That would mean you would be looking at about an 8.33 kilowatt system to completely cancel out your electric bill, caveats depending on what programs are available in your area, et cetera. So a system like that in Washington State is typically about $2.80 something cents a watt in Washington State is kind of the average price that we're seeing. So that means that an 8.33 kilowatt system would cost about, let's say, $24,000. So to calculate the tax credit, you just take that number and you multiply it by 30%, and you would be eligible to apply over $7,000 towards your tax liability. Again, go back to part one, the recording, to get a full walkthrough on that. So let's take this example, and these are just purely examples. This is not tax advice. Please talk to your tax professional, but these are just simplified examples of how this tax credit might impact your tax liability. So if you owe more than what your tax credit from solar is, you could hypothetically just have your bill to the IRS go down by whatever amount your solar tax credit is. If you've already paid more than what your tax credit is, and let's say you've paid everything you owe, you'd be at zero otherwise, that's when the IRS will potentially issue a refund, just like they would if you had overpaid on taxes or anything else, because that becomes a credit towards what you owe. And then if you owe less than the amount of the tax credit, the remaining credit just rolls to the next year. You still have to apply for it and all of that. But I believe you have up to 5 years to claim the tax credit. Please don't quote me on that. I think it's 4 or 5. And then it gets a little bit more complicated. So let's say you have tax liability of $10,000, but you've already paid $7,500 taken out of your paychecks or whatever the situation is. That means that your tax liability is going to go down by about $7,000 to really your $10,000 is now $2,800. So because you've already paid $7,500, you're now going to get a tax refund, potentially of that difference in amount between what you now owe and what you'd already paid. Again, super simplified, but just wanted to make sure it's clear that you're not just automatically going to get a check for this amount. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to solar financing, and that is because there is a common practice where solar loans often require a 30% payment at a certain period of time in the loan terms. Otherwise, your payments go up, which, is fine if this is what you're agreeing to, but it's not always made clear. So in this particular case, this loan requires that if you don't give a 30% payment 18 months following the start of the loan, your payments are going to go up by almost $100 a month. Now, given when that happens in the term of the loan, what that means is your options are essentially to give the company 30%. In this case, it was $16,000 plus on the value of that 30%, the tax credit, to the loan. But again, remember, you might not get that. If you don't get that, now you all of a sudden have to make a $16,000 payment on this loan, or your payments go up by $100 a month. And for comparison, for the life of that loan, if the payments go up by that amount, that's an additional $26,000. So you end up paying over $10,000 more over the course of the loan. And so that's where people can really find themselves in tight situations, just not understanding and not having been told exactly how the loan terms work and how it financially impacts them. In Washington State, we have a solar sales tax exemption. It literally means you do not pay sales tax. The solar installer does not collect sales tax from you if the system is under 100 kilowatts. 100 kilowatts is a really key number in Washington State for solar. That is kind of the maximum for residential incentives, is a 100 kilowatt system. And so the sales tax exemption is through 2029. The Department of Revenue, which Chantal will share a link to, does have rules for installers in order to be eligible to pass on the sales tax exemption. And we'll talk more about those types of requirements in part 3 when we look at actually reviewing an installer and their qualifications. And then the way this process happens is typically a solar installer gives you a form from the Department of Revenue. They check a few boxes. You sign that form saying, yes, I purchased this thing that is sales tax exempt. And then the solar installer keeps that on file so that if the Department of Revenue audits them, they have a record of what it was that they sold and why they weren't required to collect sales tax on it. If by some chance you end up paying sales tax, you do have the option to file for a refund from the Department of Revenue for the sales tax that you paid. And there are different rules for larger systems. So if you're looking at a commercial install or a utility scale install, there's just a little bit different sales tax exemption structure with a few more specific requirements. So just something to be aware of. And then the other big thing that is very common around the country is net metering. Washington State has a net metering law. And so another recap to part 1, this is the general, very poorly done schematic of what a solar installation and the flow of electricity looks like. And on the right, with the bright orange around it, you have a meter, which is a reminder, if you get solar, that becomes a net meter, which will both keep track of the energy you are buying from the utility and the extra solar power you are giving back to the utility in exchange for a credit. That is the very, very simple explanation of net metering. So it is a law in Washington State that you can offset your electricity consumption from renewable energy. And again, the way that works is the surplus energy goes back to the grid and you get a credit on your bill. These credits expire every year. So if you get a system that is larger than your annual energy use, you are going to potentially lose the value of those credits. On the flip side, if you have a bad solar year, you just continue to buy power from the utility like you normally would, and you just don't have the same level of credits to apply to it. Now, for it to qualify, these systems must be less than 100 kilowatts, same as the sales tax exemption. So that's where the 100 kilowatts can be a key system size. It must be located on your premises, so you can't basically pay for your neighbor to do it, or it comes up sometimes during rental properties how to facilitate that. But if it's your home and you're the utility holder, you're good. And then they have to be grid tied. So if you have an off-grid solar system and absolutely no service from the utility, you won't be eligible to receive this because you aren't connected to the utility to send the electrons back. So just to be aware of that. And then with this, you get to offset part of your electricity consumption. And so net metering is available on a first come, first served basis until either June of 2029 or when your utility hits a minimum threshold, which is 4% of the utility's peak demand during 1996, very specific, then the utility has a choice of what they want to do. So the Washington State University Energy Extension publishes a report twice a year, which Chantal will put in the chat. And this is how they keep track of what the utilities report for where they currently are in terms of that 4%. So if you go to that webpage, what you'll see is a list of numbers like we have a screenshot of, for examples, on our screen. So what this means is Okanogan County Co-op, they're at 151% of the 4%. Okanogan County PUD is at 14% of the 4%. And so 100% is essentially the 4% limit has been reached. Now, when utilities hit this limit, it doesn't automatically mean you can't do a solar installation and receive net metering anymore. What it does is it allows the utilities to redefine the program and what the terms under which they're willing to credit you are. And the other thing is on that WSU webpage, there's a column that says yes or no, and what that's indicating is whether or not the utility is still doing the standard net metering, the dollar for dollar, credit for credit, or if they have developed a different program. And so this is where it's really important to know utility by utility what your value of your energy is, including what the value of your credit is, the rules for solar, and the limits. Because if your utility has already hit that 4% cap, what happens is they can essentially go in and do a rate making process. So Puget Sound Energy just did this through the Utility and Transportation Commission, which oversees them. And then there are some co-ops and some public utility districts that have hit this cap, and they went to their boards, who are typically elected or membership represented, and said, hey, we'd like to. Now, the options for what they want to do in those situations are continue the program as is, kilowatt produced, kilowatt credit, etc. But they can also say, hey, we're going to reduce the system size. We don't have to accept 100 kW system sizes anymore. We're going to stop at 25. They could say, we're not going to give a dollar for dollar credit anymore. If you produce extra electricity, we're only going to give you half of what the retail value is. And that gets tricky because sometimes you'll look at that and you'll see, oh, I'm only getting this much from my utility. Well, that's true, but also if you're using the solar power, you're still getting the full retail savings because you're not buying that power from the utility. And then you're getting a reduced credit rate if you sell it back. So it's really important to find out what your utility status is and what program they are following and what their rules are, because more and more utilities are starting to hit that peak. Puget Sound Energy, one of the bigger utilities, I saw a lot of companies advertising kind of panic mode that they were close to their cap. They are, but they got an extension from the Utility and Transportation Commission to continue the net metering program as is. It's either through or until 2025. I should remember that. So it just depends. The other thing is no matter what ends up happening, you will almost always still have an electric bill. I know a lot of companies like to tell you you'll never have a utility bill again. You still have that service fee, that meter fee, taxes, things like that. You will still be getting a bill from your utility because those base fees, that cost of providing service, is not credited as part of the net metering credits. And then there are other incentives. Chantal will put the link to this website in the chat. It's called Desire. It is from the North Carolina University, I believe. And it is a database of not just solar, but a bunch of renewable energy and energy efficiency and electrification incentives across the country. And you can just go in and filter, are you looking at solar specifically? Or are you curious about everything available in your area? They aren't always the most up to date. They don't always have the most information, but it's a really great just one-stop shop to kind of see what incentives are available. And they also cover things like policies. So the net metering policy in Washington State is one that they would have in their database. Some areas have property tax exemptions for renewable energy. It depends on your area. We're not going to get into the more specific jurisdiction or utility today. Just know that there's resources out there. And moving along, we're going to switch to financing. So you can always pay cash for solar. If an installer doesn't give you that option, they're probably motivated to sell you the loan as well. I know folks where they have decided to take an early withdrawal on their retirement because the tax credits from the solar will cancel out the penalties. You know, you can go about this whatever way works for you. It's just a matter at that point of you're paying the installer cash. You can get a loan where the equity of the loan is based, or sorry, the collateral of the loan is based on the solar. And so those are typically UCC filings where the serial number of the solar is what has a lien on it. It's filed, there's a record, you owe somebody money, and these solar panels are what is against that. There's also a fixture loan that's sometimes used on things like appliances. Those can also be used for solar. And often with those loans, companies will say, you don't have any collateral on your house. There's no deed on your home. Technically, that's true. But if you have those solar panels and those solar panels are listed at your address, if you go to sell your home, that's still going to come up on the research that a real estate agent will do. So it can still be an encumbrance. It can still get in the way of you selling your home. The other thing is home equity loans. So you could do a HELOC, you could do a just general refinance. There's all kinds of options. There's also a couple of options through the federal government where if you're someone who wants to do these programs and might not want to do traditional financing, HUD has programs available, and Chantal will put a link to those in the chat. So you've got lots of options. And then other ways to finance solar aren't as common in Washington State on the residential side. One is where you lease the panels. The company still owns the panels, and you're essentially paying for the privilege of having those solar panels on your roof every month and getting to take the energy tax credit. So it used to be that these especially weren't popular because when we had other incentive programs, these didn't qualify, but those incentives have gone away now. It's just typically our energy production is so low and our utility rates are so cheap that it doesn't financially make sense. And so companies don't offer them a lot around here. And then the other one is a power purchase agreement, where we typically see these is large scale. So large corporations, utilities are essentially saying, hey, you've got this project, we'll buy all the power from you at this wholesale pre-negotiated rate. There are some areas where that happens in a residential setting. I think Texas is one of them, but we just really don't see them in Washington. And then with the loan types, like I said, the collateral matters because it can impact how it's presented to you and also how it impacts your choices going forward. We're going to cover more about like what happens if you want to sell your house after you have solar installed in the fourth part of our series. But basically home equity based, you do get an encumbrance on your house. There are lots of options for how to do that. And then there's the solar equipment as the collateral, serial numbers, and there's still an impact on the property, even though it isn't technically against your house. And then PPAs and loans are contracts that are specifically with the solar company typically, so those can have some interesting terms and conditions. And then lender types, just I won't go through all these, but as a reminder, if you don't have a relationship with an existing financial institution, there are credit unions, which are non-for-profit. They're owned by the membership. And you've got your traditional bank, the government, like the HUD loans typically come with lots of paperwork, but it can have an additional level of oversight that if you're feeling unsure, they can help with that. And then there's also in addition to this, some companies will offer in-house financing, or they will represent the third-party financer. And in that case, it's really connected to the sale. They're acting as both the lending agent and as the sales representative. It can get kind of complicated. And then there are other installers who say, look, we don't offer financing. Here's a list of the lenders that we typically work with. I know we have at least 2 credit unions in Washington State that are actually offering solar specific lending programs. So you've got options. But then there are some common loan practices to watch out for. Some, like I said, is at the beginning is you get your 30% federal tax credit value has to be applied to the loan or your payment goes up. The other thing to watch for is that the loan terms and timelines for milestones and performance might not actually be tied to the loan. So if you get a solar install and the installation's done and you sign and say, yep, it's done, and the installer gets paid, and then there's an issue, or it turns out it hasn't actually been interconnected to the utility yet, that loan's already been paid. You owe payments regardless of whether that system ever works a day in its life. So that is something to be aware of. What are the milestones when payments are due? What are the milestones when the loan pays the installer? And how do you make sure that the installation performance has some teeth to it through that lending program? You don't just want to pay the solar installer and have them leave and have the system not work. The other thing with these loans is there can be dealer and origination and other fees that aren't always obvious. A lot of the time, those end up looking like a cash discount. So the installer will say it's $50,000, but if you pay us cash, it's $45,000. Typically, that $5,000 is some type of fee that's getting passed on from the lender. And part of the reason they do it that way is to try and get it covered in such a way that it can apply to the 30% federal tax credit, which, as I said earlier, they're technically not supposed to do. So just be very careful. Make sure you read all of your documentation and understand that you've got multiple options when it comes to financing. You're not stuck with one installer's preferred lender. And as an example, some of those common practices are starting to get some scrutiny. So the Minnesota Attorney General's office actually is suing several national solar lending companies. I've seen mosaic loans and dividend loans in Washington state, and yeah, just something to pay attention to is what lender you're being asked to work with. And again, make sure you read everything carefully. So next steps in the process, if you want to understand what your incentives are, look at what your utilities net metering status and program rate is. Where are they towards that 4%? What are they offering now? Have they talked about what they want to do if and when they hit that 4%? And are they going to hit that 4% before the program naturally is scheduled to end in 2029? And I should add, if it ends in 2029, if you already have a solar install, the understanding is that that continues for you because you've already gotten into the program. It's not that the net metering program just ends at 2029. The enrollment opportunity ends in 2029. I want to clarify that. The other thing is some utilities offer additional assistance or funding. Maybe they've got preferred contractors that already know their rules and policies. Maybe they've got a rebate program. Just it's always worth asking. And then the other thing to do is estimate your tax liability. So again, this isn't the check that you have to write in April. This is overall, what do you typically owe the IRS in a year? And then you can talk to a tax professional as well with that and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. Might it make sense to do an early withdrawal from retirement? Or do I have sufficient tax liability to be able to take advantage of this credit? And then for financing options, if you've already got a lender that you've got a good relationship with, whoever your preferred person is, you can just ask them like, hey, this is what we're looking at. Do you guys offer a program for this? What are your home equity options? And then the other thing you can do is research solar specific loans. I know Solar Washington has a couple of members that are credit unions, again, that specifically have solar lending programs. And then when you attend the next webinar, we're going to talk about how you might accidentally end up owing an installer $10,000 without even buying solar. We're going to look at how to check the retail value of various solar components, how to evaluate a solar company's qualifications, how to look at what is in the quote for solar, how to compare quotes, what's a site assessment and why is it important. So we hope to see you either next Tuesday or on the recording in the future where we go over additional parts of the process. And if you have any questions, you are welcome to send them to us at this email address, info@solarwa.org. We've already gotten several. We're doing what we can to answer them as quickly as we can, but we appreciate engagement and specific questions coming in. It also helps inform our next presentation. And then you can register for part 3 of the webinar series, which is getting and reviewing your solar quote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. This was, I thought you kind of overdid it on the first one in terms of your expertise and your knowledge, and you blew my mind one more time today. So thank you for that. We have a lot of questions, quite a few of them. I think you may find the answer to if you watch the first webinar. And the main answer to several of the questions is yes, we will be sending you a link to this recording. It's going to come to you within 24 hours of this webinar being over. And eventually all of this will go on a web page and with all the resources and whatnot. The other question was, yes, did you see, I hope all the links were in the chat, not in the question pane. I don't see what you see right now, so I'm not sure exactly how to guide you to this. But I will also, because there's so many links, I will also include them in a document that I will attach to that message you will receive in 24 hours. Quick question, actually two quick questions. I think we still have a little bit of time. One, Deborah, you mentioned several times, you mentioned in the previous presentation in part one, as well as in this one, a solar financial calculator. And I wanted to see, and we had a lot of questions about that. What is the best way to get short of reproducing this on a spreadsheet, is there a way we can have access to such a thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are lots of tools available online. It's just they're not always what they appear. So there are a lot of solar calculators, solar estimators, where you put in your address, your email address, your phone number, and it gives you a rough estimate of how much solar you would need and what your potential energy savings is and what the potential cost is. The thing is, a lot of those free tools are actually lead generators. And so they won't let you submit until you've put in your contact information, and then they sell that contact information to solar installers. So you might end up getting, I know somebody who said they got 5 phone calls within 3 days, but 5 phone calls per day within 3 days from basically call centers trying to book a solar appointment for them. There is a resource through Google, I think it's called Project Solar. That's one where they don't have more rural areas included. The thing with these calculators is it's always generic. It's always just to give you a general idea. And so it might not take your utility's specific rate into consideration. It might not take that tree that's shading the west side of your roof in the evening into consideration. The best way to really get an estimate is to do a site assessment or to work with a solar installer. There is one tool I'll mention because I created it on my website, solarquotecheck.com. It's a free calculator that doesn't collect any contact information. And I did that by syncing it up with county data. So you just pick what county you're in and it'll use the data from that county. But again, it's very generic, but it doesn't require any contact information because it's not intended to be a lead generator.
Thank you. On a related topic, if you're doing such a calculator, you may need to know what your electricity consumption is. Is that something you can find out pretty easily from your utility, or is there some process to figure out how much energy you need for your location?
Yeah, so there's a few things. The easiest way to do it is to just call your utility and ask, hey, how much power did I use in the last year, or what's my average annual use? And they can tell you that pretty quickly. Most, if not all, utility bills in Washington State have to have an annual graph of your energy usage that compares like this year versus last year, temperature sometimes, things like that. That can give you an idea of it, but in that case, you have to look at the kilowatt hours and add them up. And so that's not exact. The other thing is take into consideration if you're planning on doing anything that could add to your electric load or take away from your electric load. So if you're going to switch from a gas heating system to an electric heating system, that might mean you're going to need a little bit more power if you're getting an electric car. But if you're getting new windows, maybe you don't need as much heat. And again, You don't have to do a solar install to power your entire house to offset your entire bill. If you want to just do a quarter of it, half of it, whatever your budget allows. Just want to make sure it's clear. You don't have to do your entire home's energy bill.
Okay. So, yeah. So, for example, if I qualify for net metering because my utility has not yet reached the 4% threshold, will the rate at which I would receive credits remain grandfathered after the utility hits the threshold? A very good question.
Yes, it would. And so that is going to be tied to your utility rate. The quiet part that solar installers won't say out loud, but I will, is solar installers are actually they kind of benefit when a utility raises their rates, because that means you get a higher energy savings, a higher credit value. And so under net metering, once you're locked in, your rate of crediting will increase as the utility rates increase. That's something I didn't mention, is some installers will look at the inflation rates related to electricity and try and calculate that into the return on investment. Good or bad, just make sure that data is accurate and that you understand that that's what's happening. The one thing with grandfathering in that we'll talk more about in the fourth part of our series is if you sell your home and it becomes occupied by someone else, you might lose the access to net metering, and the new homeowner might have to join under whatever program is available at the time.
Thank you. What is and you also touched on that in part one, but what is there a process to estimate how much productivity I can get on my roof? I know there are websites that do that. Somebody was actually asking, is there a meter that I can put on my roof to figure it out? Or what would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we're going to get into a little bit more about that in part 3, getting a quote. So you can always do a rough estimate. So there's tools like PV Watts, a link that we've shared in the past. I don't know, Chantal, if you can add that into chat again, where you can go in and you can say, if I have a system that's X kilowatts and it's facing east, south, west, approximate angle of your roof, guess what your shading is, right? I think it's a percentage base. So you can just kind of guess and play with it. That will show you an average and estimate. What we'll talk about more in the next presentation is how there are different tools that solar installers will use to do that kind of metering and more scientific assessment. Some of them are online. They can do an okay job where they show GIS data and LiDAR data to kind of get a sense of how much energy is on your roof. And then the other tools are actually on site. So in the next presentation, I'll talk about a tool called Solar Pathfinder, where you can just, with one image, a snapshot, you'll see an outline of all the trees, and it'll be referenced to your location when they upload it into your software. And they'll be able to literally tell you, hey, from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., this tree is going to shade your solar, and that is going to impact your system by X percentage. I know a few people who actually, when they were getting a site assessment, said, hey, can you help me figure out where I should put my garden? It's a pretty cool tool, but they're fairly expensive. So in most cases, getting a solar site assessment is the simpler option than trying to use one of those tools yourself.
Thank you. So we don't have a chance or the time to go to all of the questions. We only have about 30 seconds left. Just can you confirm, because there's a question about it, the calculator you created is solarquote.com?
Solarquotecheck.com.
Check.com.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you again, Dever. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us today. I hope that, please register for the next one. You will only receive the information if you are registered. As you know, it's a free webinar, so no question asked. Just go back to the webpage and register, and we'll see you in a few days then. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Dever, and have a fantastic weekend if you're watching live.
Bye, everyone.